This morning, our gospel passage is from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. Hear this good word. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords, and he drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So this is a very famous and familiar story to many of us. So let's take a little time to create some context for this story. First of all, the story takes place in the Grand Temple in Jerusalem. And the temple had 4 sections. It had the Holy of Holies, which is believed this is where God lived and dwelled. Outside of the Holy of Holies, you had the court of men. And outside of the court of men, you had the court of women. And then outside of the court of women, you had the court of the nations, the Goyim. Now, what was the purpose for this court? There were people from all over the world who were not born Jewish, but who adopted the Jewish religion as their own. So in the high holy seasons, they would take their pilgrimage to Jerusalem to participate in the rituals and the sacrifices and the worship during these high seasons. Now, there were 2 parts of the ritual that they would participate in. One would be paying the temple tax, which is to help them provide this ministry to the people as they came to worship on these high holy days. And another was to purchase an animal for sacrifice. Now, why is that? Well, in order to pay the temple tax, you had to use the currency of the temple. So if you were traveling from other parts of the world and you did not have the currency of the temple, then you had to go exchange your currency for the temple currency to pay your temple tax. Another part of it is that you could not offer up an animal for sacrifice unless it was approved of by the priest. So, rather than taking a risk of traveling a long distance with an animal that might not be acceptable or that possibly something could happen to the animal on your way there, people would not bring the animal. They would just wait and buy one that had been pre-approved when they arrived. Now, if any of you have ever exchanged money, you know that there are fees involved. I remember the first time I went to Europe in 2010, and the flat that Amy and I rented in Rome, the owner of the flat required us to pay the rent for that flat upfront in euros in cash. I was not at all comfortable carrying that much cash with me on my trip, but I'd managed to do so safely. But when I went to the currency exchange place at the Millennium Mall, I was aghast at how much money it cost me to make that exchange. Fortunately, credit cards now allow you to make purchases overseas, and they might charge you 3%. So there's a wonderful bypass for that now, and you don't have to pay those exorbitant fees. But anytime you go and exchange money and currency, there's some kind of commission and fee and things involved. This is what was happening in the temple when the pilgrims came to worship. And as I said earlier, as they came to worship, then they also had to buy the animals for sacrifice. Now, where did all this exchange and purchase take place? Where was all these transactions taking place? It was taking place in the outer temple and the outer courts of the temple, the court of the nations, the Goyim. So you have people who are traveling from all over, who need to exchange their money to buy their animal for sacrifice. And while those pilgrims who were not born Jewish were trying to worship and be a part of the ritual and the worship experience, there was all this commerce taking place and noise in the temple. When Jesus saw it, he was not pleased. He was not at all pleased. One of the things that's consistent when we read the Gospels, all four of them, is that Jesus had tolerance for many things. Jesus had incredible compassion and patience for many things. But one thing that he did not have any tolerance or patience for was how religious authorities exploited people who came to God to worship. And that was the case here. So he made a whip out of cords. He started releasing animals, turning over tables. Money was flying everywhere. And anytime a person interferes with commerce to make a point, that person then makes enemies. And that was no different here. Jesus had become appalled at the transactional religion that was taking place in his temple, in God's temple, in his Father's house. And he pitched a fit. But he pitched a fit for a purpose. So, anytime you are interfering with commerce, the powers that be are typically the powers that hold the purse. And when you interfere with their ability to make money, then you make enemies. Now, there was a sitcom that was on TV years ago, and I know this is a very old reference for some of you, but it's a classic show. It's called Mork and Mindy. And this is really where Robin Williams, the late great comedian, got his start as far as national acclaim. He was a person from another planet who came to Earth to report on the doings of human beings and trying to understand why they do what they do. Mork is staying in an apartment where Mindy lives, and she has taken him in. And there was a point in one of the stories where Mork was wanting something, and she wouldn't allow him to have it. And he kept insisting, she kept debating him over it. And finally, she laid her foot down, and she says, look, this is my apartment. I pay the rent. I pay the utilities. I buy the groceries. It's my apartment. It's my house. It's my rules. I'll never forget this when I heard it and saw it the very first time. Then Mork says, the golden rule, those who have the gold rule. All right? So, yes, if you don't know this reference, go on YouTube, Hulu. I'm sure it is being played somewhere in all the streaming that's available. And the shows are hilarious. But yes, the golden rule, those who have the gold rule. So, yes, Jesus made enemies that day. And in fact, we see that in the story, right? The authorities come up to him, by what authority? Show us some kind of sign that you have the authority to do this. What is wrong with you? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Now, what happens next in the story is a very common motif in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is often speaking and teaching in symbolism or in metaphor. And then the listeners are often taking him literally, and they miss the point. Another most common and familiar story is when Nicodemus came to see him at night. And he told Nicodemus that if you want to enter into the kingdom of God, you must be born anew or be born again. And then Nicodemus famously says, what, I'm an old man. I crawl back in my mother's womb and come back out again. And the problem that Nicodemus had was understanding the metaphorical messages behind Jesus' teaching while taking him literally. So, the religious authorities in this story do the same. It took us 46 years to build this temple, and you say that we knock it all down, you will rebuild it in 3 days? Are you out of your mind? They missed the point, because Jesus was not speaking of the physical temple. Jesus was speaking of his body. Another thing, just for your information, the Gospel of John was written in a guess between 90 and maybe 110 CE. This would have been a good 70 to 50 years after the Jesus event. 40 years after the Jesus 70. Okay. 70 years or longer. Don't ask me to do math when I'm preaching. Okay, so the people who were hearing or reading this story would have been well aware that in 70 CE, the Romans had destroyed that temple. And even to this day, there's a remnant of that temple in Israel, in Jerusalem, and we know it most commonly as the Wailing Wall. That's a remainder of just one of the walls. And on the big platform on top where the temple stood is the Al-Aqsa Mosque and also the Dome of the Rock. So big holy place for both Muslim and Jews. But the people hearing the story would have known that information when Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed. So I guess it's safe to conclude that you come into a very public place and you have a very public display. You pitch a fit on a biblical scale. You're letting animals out, you're turning over tables, money is going everywhere, and the powers that be probably don't like you very much anymore. And probably what was started as a genuine service for pilgrims coming to worship, at some point started becoming exploited, and at another point, there's a lot of money that can be made here. And we can make it off of these people who travel to come and worship here on the high holy days and justify it because, well, that's just the price you have to pay. So Jesus makes his point very clear. He was not happy with the people who were exploiting the pilgrims who came to God's house to worship. This should not be so unfamiliar to us about how interfering with commerce or economics causes the powers to get angry. I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but as a person who has studied U.S. history in particular, whenever there was ever a cause where social justice was involved, it seems that the federal government nor the state governments would create legislation to correct the social injustice unless something happened that created so much cost that they felt that they had to do it. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was the bus boycott, that people of color were the ones who were the primary support for the bus systems, but the buses were segregated. So they were relegated to sit in the back of the bus while white people could sit in the front of the bus because for some reason in Alabama in the mid-60s, white people and black people sitting on the bus together was just not acceptable. So then they had the bus boycott. So all of those people of color who rode the buses to go to their jobs started walking, and for months and months and months they walked to work until lo and behold, the bus companies were losing a lot of income, right? And so as history provides the story, buses are now no longer segregated. Did the bus companies do it because it was the right thing to do? No, because it was too costly. So most movements in the United States are changed because the costs become too high for the powers that be. Now, one thing that I want to bring to your attention is that in the Gospel of John, Jesus cleansing the temple happens at the beginning of the story, whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it happens at the end of the story. And the other three in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this was the last straw for the powers that be, and after Jesus turns over the tables and creates the scene in the temple, then the religious authorities and the powers that be then plot to finally have him arrested and crucified because they're not going to deal with him anymore. But one of the things that the story that John shows us at the beginning is it sets the stage for the kind of Messiah, the kind of teacher, the kind of liberator that Jesus is going to be. One thing he makes a point in the very beginning is this, that he absolutely despised how religious authorities exploited people. And he created a great public display to make his point. And look, religious institutions exploiting vulnerable people has been going on since then. It has nothing to do with a particular religion, but it's just people who have no real sense of connectedness to the divine, see a money-making opportunity here, and they will use it. There's one popular kind of ministry going on today called prosperity gospel. I've mentioned it to you before, but the whole concept of prosperity gospel is that if you give the church $100, then you're going to get that tenfold. If you give the church $1,000, then you're going to get $10,000. And what happens is you find people who are financially vulnerable, right? They may not actually have $1,000, or it may be the last bit of money that they have, but they sit there week after week and they hear the testimonies of all these people who took this leap of faith and who did this, and they write that church a check for $1,000 they really don't have, and they don't get $10,000 in return. And none of the powers that be in the church take responsibility for that. They blame the person who wrote the check. You must not have been faithful enough. It's your fault that you did not get the tenfold return on your investment into God's ministry, you see? People who are vulnerable and desperate financially will do these things believing that the religious people who are teaching them are telling them the truth. And I would imagine that if Jesus were walking this planet today, he would walk in some of those prosperity gospel churches and start turning over some stuff pretty quickly. All right. So how can we now take this story about Jesus' passion for the temple, for his passion for creating a place for people who travel and who make a pilgrimage to worship, have an opportunity to worship without all the noise and the distraction of commerce taking place in their court, right? How can we take this story to create a deeper understanding for ourselves? Well, let's start here. Jesus in this story says that his body was the temple. The temple he referred to was his body. So our body, like Jesus' body, is a temple. Our mind, like Jesus' mind, is a temple. So what are we putting into our mind? Our soul, like Jesus' soul, is a temple. How connected are we to this temple? And just like in the story of the great temple in Jerusalem, at the center of it was the Holy of Holies. And I believe that in the center of our soul and the center of us is the Holy of Holies, a place where the divine dwells. But then we must ask ourselves, how far are we from that center? Which court do we find ourselves living in most of the time? And if we feel estranged from the divine that dwells within us, maybe it's because most of our time is being spent on those outer courts where all that noise and confusion is taking place. And look, that is not a judgment. And that's not a statement saying that somehow you are lesser than because you're distracted. Just think about where we are living right now with the rest of the world with this pandemic. There are economic stresses, business stresses, social stresses, people, family members who have been separated. While I was in line today, a person started to weep when she got her shot. She says, I have not seen my mama in over a year, and I can go see her now. This is very real stuff. People who have businesses are finding that they can barely make ends meet, and they're having to lay off their employees. People who've been laid off or who've been furloughed, are struggling. Where are we going to find money to pay the rent? People don't have food to eat. These are real distractions and noises all around us. So it's not a judgment. But at the same time, it's a challenge for us in the midst of this kind of chaos to be able to be connected to our center. And it is that connection that helps us to navigate ourselves through these busy, chaotic times. So how many courts outside from the center do we find ourselves living? And what are the consequences for that? Well, once again, this is not a judgment, but it's an observation. Typically, before a human being will create real change in their lives, there's been a great cost involved. back in 1997, when I was at a place in my life where I had to make some very, very hard, difficult choices, I read this book by Tony Robbins called The Giant Within. And one of the things that I gleaned from that book is it said, set out who you want to be, what your goals are, and then list down the things you need to do to accomplish those goals. And to help to motivate you, he said, is put all the benefits. If I do this, what are all the real benefits I get from that? And then on the other side, if I choose not to do this, what are the costs? And the idea is to help you to see how great the costs are not to take action compared to the benefits by taking action immediately, right? But in the human experience, typically, a cost must take place before we create change. Once we lose our health, it's amazing how much time we spend thinking about our health. Once we lose our mobility, it's amazing how much time we think about what it was like to be mobile. Once we lose our independence, it's amazing how much time we think about our independence and how we just took it for granted for so many years. Once a person loses their family or their friends because of unhealthy behaviors and or decision making, it's amazing how precious those family members and friends become after you've lost them. Typically, for us to create change in our life, a great cost must be involved. Last week's sermon, Jesus asked the question, what is it to gain the whole world and lose your life? And the word life in that passage was not bios or zoe. The word life was psyche, which is the Greek word for soul. What is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? What is it to be the entrepreneur who owns the money exchanging and who also owns the market where the animals are being sold and all this commerce are taking place? What is it to gain all that wealth and all that power on the outer courts far away from the Holy of Holies? What is it to gain all of that and lose your soul? We cannot lose our soul, my friends, regardless of how crazy and chaotic things are around us. Your soul is your center, and it's imperative that regardless of what's going on around us, that we have the capacity to be able to connect to that center. Remember, your soul knows before you are often conscious of knowing what needs to be done. So your soul, if it needs to, will flip over the tables in your outer court where you're dwelling way too much, or where you're dwelling way too long, right? Your soul knows. Your soul will create situations that will create cost so that it gets your attention. And when you have, and when your soul has your attention, then change can take place. If your soul needs to pitch a fit in your temple, it will do it. Our soul, our psyche, wants us to cleanse our body and our mind and let go of the distractions that separate us from having that deep knowing, that Greek word gnosko, that deep, intimate knowing of the beautiful divine which lives and dwells within all of us. And whether we are proactive and create the change, or if it takes an event in our life that is so costly, we must change. Either way, the important thing is that being proactive or reactive, the purpose is to draw us closer to the center of our temple, where the Holy of Holies lives, which is our God, which is the divine. That's the purpose. That's the purpose. Do whatever it takes to cleanse your body, to cleanse your mind, to connect to your temple, and to live consciously with the divine deep within you. And whatever it takes to get us there in the long run is worth it. Thus ends the lesson. God bless you all. I'll see you next week. Amen.